Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Rob Mess, and today's topic is photographing pumas in Patagonia. Before we get into it, though, we do have a few quick housekeeping notes. You've joined us in listen only mode and will remain muted throughout the presentation. For the best experience, please close unnecessary browsers and programs to optimize your internet's bandwidth. You have two audio options for listening today through your computer speakers, of course, or you can dial in on your phone. Use the GoToWebinar control panel to manage those audio settings. If you're joining us on a mobile device, you may need to swipe left or right to toggle between the webcam and the presentation view. You can submit questions anytime during the webinar. Just use the question field in your control panel. We'll have a question and answer session at the end until the top of the hour. The session is being recorded and you will receive the replay link via email. You can find a full lineup of presentations, including replays and registration links at nathab.com/webinars. All right, my friends, let's get started. Once again, welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's presentation, Photographing Pumas in Patagonia, is brought to you by NatHab Expedition Leader Anthony Amsel. Anthony is a wildlife biology specialist from Montreal who has built a career in conservation, research, and wildlife management. He's a member of the prestigious Canadian Conservation Photographers Collective, and his work has been featured in Canadian Geographic as a seasoned expedition leader specializing in Arctic ecology and marine wildlife. Anthony has guided expeditions across diverse northern landscapes from Greenland's icy fjords to Hudson Bay's coastal tundra, combining his scientific expertise with exceptional nature photography skills. And we are lucky that Anthony is here with us today on Daily Dose. Anthony, thanks for being here. The show is yours. Take it away.
Rob, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have some of these webinars going on. And hello, everybody. I hope that you are having a wonderful, wonderful day. So, of course, today we're going to be talking about photographing pumas in Patagonia. And for those of you who can see my webcam, you see that I have my own little puma here at home, Odin, who has become somewhat webinar famous, if you will. But talking about pumas, we're going to be diving into a lot of wonderful, wonderful features about these animals and, of course, their habitat and photographing them. But this isn't your typical photography webinar because we're going to explore the story of pumas through photography. So, of course, we'll be answering some questions in terms of technical facets that help us in our, of course, quest to photograph these elusive predators. But of course, we're going to do much more of a deeper dive to really learn about their story and what's happening today in terms of conservation in Patagonia. As Rob mentioned, my name is Anthony Amsel. I, of course, wear 3 hats on a daily basis as a wildlife biologist, a wildlife photographer, and an expedition leader. It has what has really shaped my work and my portfolio up to date. And it is those 3 hats that very much sharpen my goals whenever I'm either guiding or on a trip myself. And wherever I explore the world, it's really what I bring to the table in terms of being able to garner such beautiful images and being able to very much read the stories of the animals in these shots. It helps being a member of the Canadian Conservation Photographers Collective, as well as a member of Photographers Without Borders. It allows me to be part of a wonderful network of colleagues who, of course, are able to continuously teach and kind of network, and this is something I bring along with me wherever I go in the world. Now, as Rob mentioned, I generally tend to stick to northern regions. Being Canadian, one could almost say I'm cold-blooded in the best kind of way because I do love those polar regions. However, pumas are what brought me to the other side of the world, to the fantastic features of Patagonia. And just looking at this shot, this is a shot I took about 2 months ago. This to me is Patagonia. It's this land of marvel. It's untamed. It is wild. It's open, vast spaces surrounded by water features like rivers and lakes, as well as the towering Patagonian peaks at the very southern terminal of the Andes Mountains. And, you know, some of those, of course, being iconic, like the three towers that we see in the top right-hand portion of a photo. Now, beyond just being a world of wonder and a landscape that holds many secrets, Patagonia hosts and boasts some incredible ecological features, both from a flora perspective. I mean, looking at all the shrubbery in front of you, you wouldn't necessarily think that, you know, this is overtly rare by any means, but all of those dark features on the bottom of the valley that you see is actually a very important vegetative species that is latent throughout Chilean Patagonia and important to pumas. And we're going to get into that very shortly. But of course, when people come, they want to come for the wildlife as well as these spectacular landscapes, which is why when you're traveling through Patagonia, these are some of the usual suspects that people try to see. And if they're lucky, you know, really have beautiful observations like the Magellanic woodpecker on the left-hand side, the gray fox, the white-throated caracara, and the quirky little armadillos, of which there are 2 species in Patagonia. So these are just some of the little critters that you might see when you're driving around Patagonia, either on a Nat Hab trip or just on your own. But of course, for wildlife photographers, for wildlife lovers, the main attraction beyond these usual suspects is the glorious pumas of Patagonia, also nicknamed the ghosts of Patagonia, because they are quite elusive. They are meant to be elusive as Patagonia's apex predator. Of course, they would not be successful if their prey knew where they were. And it can be and is very difficult to spot them. Which is why, you know, you have wonderful guides who can take you out, and of course local experts who know where they are, know their behaviors, and photographing them on top of that can become quite tricky, which is why before we really dive into the story, I want to take a second to kind of explain the setup that will perhaps help you. It definitely helped me in ascertaining some wonderful pictures. So again, before we dive into that story, let's just take a moment to look at the technical part of this story, which is, of course, the equipment that you're going to need when you're down in Patagonia. Now, there isn't any golden rule by any means. This is something I like to take or tell my guests, pardon me, whenever I'm leading a photo trip. It's all about beauty, of course, in the end. And beauty, as the old saying goes, is in the eye of the beholder. However, there are a couple of things that might help you along the way. When it comes to pumas specifically, you may have seen, you know, incredible shots or video of these pumas walking very close to people. But of course, those opportunities are very few and far between. Generally speaking, instead, what you're going to end up with is an animal that is actually quite far away, which is why having a telephoto lens is imperative to being able to capture great shots of these animals. In this instance, what I have in front of you is my trusty 200 to 600 millimeter telephoto lens. As you'll see, there is some Sony labeling there. I'm a Sony boy myself. However, that doesn't take away from being able to use Nikon, OM, Canon, Fuji, or any market of your preference. But the bottom line here is a 200 to 600 or something even more powerful, perhaps with a teleconverter, will definitely help you really ensure that you get nice, crisp images, because oftentimes these animals are pretty far away. And we want that for 2 reasons. One, of course, they are a predator, although there is a very interesting coexistence that happens with humans. But more importantly, because we always, as photographers and as travelers, want to respect an animal's space. Giving that animal space is important for so many reasons. Of course, for a predator, it means that it has the space it needs, perhaps, to hunt its prey. Now, given the fact that it's Patagonia, given the fact that there are these major landscapes that are just almost sometimes overwhelming and you feel so immersed in them, it is also a good idea to have some sort of a wide angle lens with you. In this case, I have my 24 to 70, which is posted here. But sometimes you might want something that's even bigger. I was very successful gaining some beautiful shots that you'll see in this presentation with a 14 millimeter. So again, very much up to your preferences, but the short answer here is please make sure you have a telephoto lens if you want to have those crisp shots of a puma really far away. If you want something that allows you to have a beautiful landscape shot, having a wide angle is really, really good. However, the other accessories you see in this image become really essential to ensuring good upkeep of your lenses. Specifically, a tripod will help a lot if you have, that animal that's really, really far away. It allows you a lot more stability instead of just holding those lenses, because sometimes they are quite heavy. I know that for myself and other Sony users, we know how heavy that 200 to 600 is. So again, a tripod can help kind of take some of that weight off. Keeping in mind, however, that Patagonia is probably one of the windiest places I have ever traveled to. Now, when I was down there, thankfully, conditions were exceptional. We didn't have too much of an issue when it came to the wind. However, I'm sure people have seen videos of folks hiking in the mountains or in the valleys and just almost being swept up their feet by these unbelievable bursts of wind. So a tripod can be a good thing in the right conditions. Of course, if there's too much wind, simply a tripod will just increase some shake, pardon me. So just things to keep in mind. That wind though does also bring another challenge to us, which is dust. That wind in the dry valleys and in the dry months will just bring up so much dust, and you will end up covered in it in certain times of the year and certain times of day, of course, and your equipment will as well, which is why a rain cover, which would normally be used for rain, might be interesting to use, as it might protect your body and your lens from a lot of the dust that gets picked up. Is it essential to have it? No, I did not use one myself. I am a minimalist. I am actually very, very hard on my gear, and so far it has been trustworthy, and I've been able to bring it in many different types of environmental conditions. But it isn't a bad thing to think about and perhaps just have it handy. More importantly, though, of course, are the tools that will constantly be used to remove some of that dust, whether it's just using that little compression bulb to use the air to get all those little particles of sand off of your lenses or off of the frame, as well, of course, as an optic fiber cloth to be able to wipe off your lens in case something is sticking to it. So this is my setup that I like to use when I'm doing wildlife photography in general, but specifically the pumas. This will be very optimal. Again, I'm sure some folks are saying, a mid-range might be useful for this or for that. I'm also a minimalist, as much as I like to travel, it's sometimes difficult to bring a lot of gear. So I do try to keep it as minimal as possible, but do what works for you. That is the important thing. And momentarily, I'm going to show you all a picture I was able to grab with my 200 to 600. But for the context, before I show it, it's important to realize that, pumas, being predators, are what we call, generally speaking anyway, crepuscular, which means that they're very active at dawn and very active at dusk when the light is just starting to come into play or it's just starting to fade. Of course, this comes from a tactical perspective, from a predator's point of view, ensuring that they blend as much as possible with their surroundings. This does not mean that pumas aren't active during the day. However, like anybody knows who has a cat, in the middle of the day when the sun is really hot, cats love to just kind of lay back, relax, and literally take a cat nap. So in our circumstance for this shot of this beautiful puma, I was using my 200 to 600. I had it at 600 millimeters. Apologies for that little mistake that you see up there. It's not 600 meters, but 600 millimeters. My shutter speed was at 1/1250 to compensate for a little bit of that shake I may have had. And you'll notice my ISO was bumped up quite significantly. The reason for that, of course, is this was very early in the morning. The guide that we were with, had us out at about 5:30 in the morning. Right when pumas are at their prime, in the middle of course, Chilean summer, before things get too hot. So light was incredibly, incredibly low. However, with a little bit of post-processing magic, this is the shot. This is the shot that I was after when I knew that I was going to go down and interact with these beautiful animals. And this might not be what some people might define as the most incredible shot in the world, because you don't have the animal, in just its pure kind of context with its head outside of the vegetation, Oftentimes when photographers are looking for the quote unquote shot, they want something where there is no obstacle hiding the animal's face. But this is where I want to start shifting the perspective on photography, especially of pumas. Pumas being crepuscular, being cryptic, which defines them as being this kind of secretive animal, that grass and vegetation becomes such an integral part of that animal's story. Again, in this context, it was really early in the morning. And of course, in this shot, we see the puma looking right at us. You know, we were about perhaps 200 feet away from it. We were incredibly lucky with that specific encounter. There was no risk of danger, of course, with our local guides. With those experts, we know exactly how close or how far we need to be from those animals. But when it wasn't looking at us, it was looking across the road at its main prey source, the guanaco. You know, so for the puma, when it is hunting, it needs to be low to the ground. It needs to be hidden by that vegetation, because if it is too obvious on the landscape, the guanacos do this amazing, amazing kind of vocal alarm, and I will not try to reproduce it because I'm sure that I will make your ears bleed, but it is a highly pitched vocalization that alerts all the other guanacos in the area that, you know, a puma is around. So again, that vegetation becomes so integral to the animal story, and from this perspective, integral to the shot, because this is what was happening in the moment. You know, I wasn't necessarily waiting for that puma to lift its head up. I wanted to capture the animal in that moment. And this is the core of this webinar, is steering away from simply getting that perfect frame that we're all capturing and really trying to integrate a storyline into your shot. And again, this is a simple story in that frame, in that moment. But the puma story is so much more than that. And my goal today is to utilize photography to show you how you can build a storyboard around the story of a puma, as well as any other animal or specific ecosystem that you're trying to bring a message about. And when we look at it, again, that puma is part of so many different frames to really shape the story that we have. And before we get into that story, I want to kind of work through my process in terms of how do I achieve coming up with that story? How do I build that storyboard and select the images I want to really have a holistic perspective on this animal? To do that, there are three elements that I really try to explore before I even leave on trip. The first one, of course, are what are my goals? What do I want to do? What do I want to achieve? In this case, I wanted to really look at pumas and their habitat, but also look at the coexistence perspective that comes between pumas as an apex predator and the humans and their activities that are in the area. Of course, we'll get into that in a few slides from now, because the next element in this kind of model is research, really kind of diving into learning a little bit more about pumas before I head out. That means learning about their behavior, learning about, you know, when is the best time of year to go see them, learning about what are potential conservation initiatives happening in the area, who are the local experts that I should be talking to, not only to learn more about their stories, but to be able to get those beautiful, beautiful pictures. And beyond the goals and the research, it is so imperative to leave some room for flexibility, because when you're on trip, sometimes things just manifest on their own. And if you have too much of a stringent framework, sometimes you won't leave enough room to be able to have those beautiful moments that kind of pop out of nowhere. And a very lovely colleague of mine by the name of Julia Campini, she is also a photography guide. She says something which I adore, which is leave a little room for magic. And that flexibility portion also brings that, because when it comes down to it, you can prepare as much as you want to, but once you're out in the field, you never really know what's going to happen. So let's go into that, right? I kind of talked about what my goals were, which again is to learn more about the story of the pumas, not just in relation to Patagonia itself, but in relation to the human activities that are happening there. The research I did beforehand, of course, was looking into some of the organizations, but more importantly, learning more about pumas. And I want to take a second to look at that, because pumas, beyond just being an apex predator, they are what we call a keystone species. And the very quick definition of that is a species or an animal that has an overwhelming impact on the overall food chain and ecosystem that it resides in. So in this instance, for example, pumas are an animal that will predate anything they really can. However, they have their kind of go-to favorites, which are, again, guanacos, which we'll see in a quick moment if you have no idea what that word is. They'll sometimes also go after hair as well as anything that they can really get their jaws on. But what ends up happening is, as that apex predator, they also manage in their own way, of course, subconsciously. They manage the entire ecosystem, everything from the simple flora that we see all over the place, all the plants, the grasses, the shrubs. Those will be, of course, sustained by the carcasses that just decompose in the ecosystem and act as natural fertilizer for that flora. Those carcasses as well on the right-hand side, we'll see, will also feed other scavengers like these caracara that we have, that little family that is around that carcass of a guanaco. And then beyond that, you have other scavengers like condors in the upper right-hand side that will just be going around, like the fox as well, picking up all of those scraps. And that entire ecosystem, again, is such a delicate balance. And pumas are very much at the center of that. They are the ones that will ensure that that ecosystem stays healthy by simply doing what they're doing, which is, of course, predating and, of course, just moving around on the landscape. Beyond being a keystone species, of course, is learning about those movements, learning about those behaviors. As I said, they are crepuscular animals. They prefer dawn and dusk, especially in the hot summer months. That doesn't detract that certain individuals, of course, will not follow that golden rule. Sometimes you'll encounter pumas in the middle of the day when light is incredibly harsh from a photography perspective. And from just a behavioral standpoint, maybe it's because they're moving around. Maybe they picked up a scent or they know there's a carcass around. Just little things to research before we go, right? Now, we need to talk about guanacos because this is also an elemental facet of this story. This is one of those rivalries for the ages. So pumas being, of course, the predator and guanacos being the prey. And guanacos look very much like llamas. They look very, very similar. However, they are a different species. To my experience, anyway, I've never been spat on by a guanaco. So that is one of the ways that you know that they aren't llamas for anybody who's had that experience. But they are relatively similar in shape, relatively similar in size, and they do have that kind of llama appeal to them. But again, a very different animal. Now, for millennia, this has been the great battle between these two species, right? The pumas who will stalk these guanacos, hoping that they can get that kill. And the guanacos, of course, trying to evade this fearless, ghostly predator. You know, those guanacos, especially living in herds, as I mentioned, have that vocalization that signals to other guanacos that a puma is around. So it's not easy for these predators to get guanacos. They have to put a lot of effort into it. And if you've ever seen videos of pumas trying to take guanacos down, it is quite dramatic. I intentionally did not put it in here because I know that some people don't like to see those types of deaths happening in the animal world, even though it is a natural process. But I highly recommend going and check it out on YouTube, not for the gore part of it, of course, but simply to see the amount of effort that a puma has to put in to take down a guanaco. They specifically will go after the throat, and they are in for the ride of their lives. The guanacos do not go down easily. They will try everything in their power to really, really flip pumas off of their bodies, to get them off. And sometimes it ends in a very kind of violent battle where pumas can get injured. It's not uncommon for them to perhaps hurt their teeth, hurt their canine teeth specifically, or end up with a broken bone or a dislocation of any kind because it takes so much energy and it is such a rough encounter. And that is the strife that has happened for millennia and millennia and millennia until the late 1800s, when farming started to be a very important activity from a human perspective on the landscape. Now, Patagonia, of course, is divided into Chilean Patagonia and Argentinian Patagonia. In both cases, there is farming in Patagonia, and there are national parks all around that area. Within national parks, you won't find this type of farming. You will not find, ranches and estancias. But the important notion here is that it brought a new source of prey for pumas. Instead of only having access to guanacos now, pumas essentially had this prey that was kept in these enclosures. And as the old saying goes, it's almost like shooting fish in a barrel. If a puma made its way into the enclosure, it could easily take down sheep, which is why these beautiful animals were highly villainized from the late 1800s to very much today in 2026. They are an apex predator, and just like wolves in North America or cougars and mountain lions, which, by the way, the term cougar, mountain lion, puma defines essentially the same animal across North America. It is geographic dialects that have just given specific names to those animals in specific parts of all the Americas, pardon me. However, that predator getting into that enclosure just makes it so easy. So you can understand how, from a human perspective, again, just like wolves, just like any predator that might make its way towards livestock, these animals become a problem. They become a problem because, well, you know, you go from having a wild animal who now is becoming conditioned to coming back to these farms and these ranches to take down these animals. And you can see all the conflicts that might arise from that. And unfortunately, the simple solution to that over the last, 150-ish years has been to shoot these pumas. There's no better way to take them down apart from that. Trapping doesn't seem to work on them necessarily and would just require much more effort. So unfortunately, these pumas, as soon as they strayed out of the protected areas onto the farms and ranches, well, unfortunately, they would be taken down. But that is part of what ranch life is all about. And in this slide, it's written estancia life because in Chile, estancia means ranch, right? But it isn't just about killing pumas. And I don't want that to be the message here, because living on an estancia in Chile and Argentina is a lifestyle beyond just the pumas themselves. It is these experienced ranchers, guachos or guachas, depending on masculine versus feminine. It is a lifestyle that comes down to really becoming an expert of roaming these wild lands, farming the sheep, and creating this balance with the ecosystem. And these guachos and guachas, when you meet them, and having met them down in Chile, you understand what that lifestyle is about. Again, the idea here is not necessarily you become a rancher to kill pumas by any means. It's you become a rancher because it's in your blood. It is this incredible culture that you find in Chile. And a prime example of that is on the bottom right hand side of the frame. You'll see the beautiful saddles and stirrups that are used by the ranchers in Chile and Patagonia. And what you can see is those stirrups are very particular to guachos and guachas. You don't really get that anywhere else that I'm aware of anyway. Having talked to the ranchers when we visited this beautiful estancia, just talking so proudly about their livelihood and everything that comes with that. And again, I mentioned the balance here with the natural world, and that's something that has changed over the last few decades, especially at Estancia Cerro Guido, which is the estancia that Nat Hab travelers will stay at for 3 nights if you ever embark on this beautiful Patagonian journey with Nat Hab. Now, Estancia Cerro Guido stands out amongst the rest because they have very much reinvented themselves over the course of the last 10 years or so. And this estancia, although this building might seem quite small compared to the entire landscape, when you look at a map of Patagonia, at the very least, the part that borders the Argentinian border in Chile, you see that the estancia is quite massive. And to visually show this, we have a couple of outlines here. So the blue outline is actually Torres del Paine National Park. So the national park that we do visit when we go down on trip, and that very much borders Estancia Cerro Guido. And the national park itself, you can see that the whole outline is not there because this is a cropped part of the map, but the overall size difference isn't that massive. When it comes down to it, Torres del Paine is about 1,800 square kilometers, while the estancia is about 1,000 square kilometers. So we're talking about 55% the size of Torres del Paine. And the estancia becomes a really important facet from an ecological perspective because it offers a wildlife boundary and corridor for all the animals traveling between Torres del Paine as well as the rest of Patagonia, right? So this entire estancia extends habitat way past the park boundary. It supports the very similar wildlife populations that you'll find in Torres del Paine as well as the estancia. And it does act again as that critical buffer and corridor. But you can understand that, again, from a human perspective, having pumas on your ranch is something that is very difficult to mitigate and to manage. But the estancia has taken a very different approach from other estancias in the region, because in 2019, it founded a very important foundation called the Fundación Cerro Guido. And this foundation is not a separate entity from the estancia by any means. It is an extension of the estancia, where the estancia itself funds and hosts and even operationalizes the conservation work, while the foundation provides the scientific and conservation framework behind it. Now, they run a multitude of different projects, including monitoring wildlife, as well as coexistence projects, ecotourism, and even paleontology and geological projects that are happening on an ongoing basis. Now, today we don't have time to really go through every single one of these projects, although I highly recommend doing so because it is quite fascinating. But we are going to concentrate, of course, on puma coexistence. Now, the foundation since 2019 has been putting in so much time and effort, not only through itself, but working with other experts as well as the ranchers, as the estancia, to really have and garner a better understanding of puma conservation and management in the area. And the main way they are doing that is through a couple of different pathways. The first one being, of course, tracking. As you can see, those camera traps at the top frame of the slide become highly, highly useful because you can better understand how these pumas are moving around on the landscape. And of course, all this work is being done on the estancia itself. In fact, there is even a conservation area that was created on the estancia that holds no farming whatsoever. It is completely renaturalized to have a better understanding of the natural processes that happen on the grounds. But those cameras become so integral to understand how the pumas move around, what the numbers are looking like, because the beauty of these pumas is you can actually tell the individuals based off of coloration, potentially scars on their faces, or other, perhaps injuries that they may have sustained either in fights or in the past. So again, these camera traps become vital to understanding the population dynamics happening on the estancia and being able to extrapolate what's happening around there. Beyond that, of course, is monitoring. What's beautiful about the foundation is we get to go out with them. And this is very specific to the NatHab trip, of course. They will take people out and you get to learn directly from the scientists, directly from the conservationists, what is happening out on the land, learning about the intricacies of these animals and the conservation work being done. Of course, again, pumas are elusive, so there's no guarantee you're going to see them when you're out there. Sometimes we get lucky, and that's the beauty of it. Again, that is something I love about nature, is you have to work for these unbelievable moments, right? But regardless, it is so amazing to hear the work being done by this foundation. And ecotourism is such a huge, huge, huge part of that. And what the estancia has done is even go a step forward, which is now partner and work with other local estancias to try and have a better handle on that puma coexistence, right? And one of the big, big ways that they've been able to do that, of course, is with sheepdogs. So these sheepdogs are protectors of the flock. And the sheepdogs, they're raised on the estancias themselves. They, of course, will scour the land and the area every single day. And the goal with these sheepdogs is not to attack pumas by any means. It is to have a physical presence there so that the pumas have a bit of a reflection to do and to see if it is worth it to even try and attack the flocks themselves. Now, what the estancia has seen is what the foundation has seen based off the research they've done by collaring, these sheepdogs and seeing what's happening with collared pumas in the area as well, is they have seen that the sheepdogs are highly, highly effective at keeping the pumas at bay. Again, not necessarily having these violent physical interactions between the two animals, but simply by having the sheepdogs available, having them with the flocks, what we see is a drastic diminishment in terms of puma attacks on these sheep. So what we're seeing is a shift from shooting pumas that are coming onto estancias trying to go after livestock to these sheepdogs really creating a passive, more peaceful approach to ensure that the pumas themselves are staying alive, as well as the flocks that the estancias hold so dear to their heart. Because the livestock that they have, the sheep in particular, that wool and that meat is so important to the livelihoods, not only of the estancias, but of course the communities around them and all the workers who come in and depend on this on a day-to-day and year-to-year cycle, right? So what we're seeing is this really interesting coexistence happening between the estancia, between the humans, between their livestock and the sheepdogs, as well as the pumas themselves. And again, it's amazing to see that the estancia is now at a part through the foundation where they're able to work with other estancias and come up with these ways to have a better solution than simply eradicating the pumas. Because again, as a keystone species, if you take that keystone species out, your entire ecosystem and the landscape itself will suffer. We see this time and time again with other keystone species like bears, like wolves, for example, as I'm sure you may have seen in other stories and other, articles. But in this context, if you take the pumas out of the system, that beautiful landscape, if you recall that first image, will then suffer. And in the end, so will the livestock, because the livestock depend on, of course, the vegetation that is growing. They depend on that to be able to feed themselves. And if you take the pumas out, that affects the whole food chain, including the amount of nutrients going into that soil, feeding the vegetation, and in turn, feeding the sheep. So that kind of gives you a rough and kind of nutshelled version of the conservation efforts happening around these pumas. And you've seen all these photos that I was able to take when I was down there, apart from a couple that, of course, were supplied by the estancia. And now the idea is, how do you put all of this together, right? How do you pick your storyboard? And that, again, depends on your goals and your objectives. In this particular scenario, this would be my final storyboard. If I was presenting this to, friends and saying, hey, I went out and I pictured these beautiful pumas, but I learned about so much more. And here's a visual representation of that. Or, for example, using this for a webinar or using this in the context of conservation and public awareness. This would be personally my final storyboard from my experience of pumas in Patagonia and, Fundación Cerro Guido. And what we see is that the top line really characterizes the wildlife, with, of course, pumas being the very first elemental object in that storyline, and their old rivalry with the guanacos that has now lasted for millennia, and the roles of pumas as these keystone species. Again, that food chain being so elaborate, but also very much incorporated with the guanacos, with the pumas, and any other scavengers that are part of that. And then, of course, learning about the conflict that there is between pumas and humans, learning about, what has happened in the past, where are we now, and where are we going in the future, which is done, of course, through the solution, which is that coexistence, in this case, primarily with sheepdogs protecting flocks, as well as camera traps, as well as modern science that is happening. And there's so many more avenues that the foundation and local conservationists are taking in Patagonia to ensure that over time, these beautiful ghosts of Patagonia, instead of being executed, instead of being villainized, become part of the story of these estancias, become and continue to be, hopefully for generations to come, that integral keystone species and really that emblem of the wilds of Patagonia. So that, my friends, is how I go about building my storyboards. Again, starting with what are my goals? What is the research I need to do, as well as staying flexible. And then over time, taking these pictures based off of all those elements, as well as some surprises that may come along the way, and then putting it all together to create that story that is so much more than just getting the shot. It allows yourself or anyone looking at your images to really dive a lot deeper and to find meaning behind just the picture itself. Because it is, on a certain level, when you have the experience, when you have the technical skills, it can become slightly easy to just take a picture and to just enjoy it for what it is. And for some people, that is great. And of course, I'm not taking anything away from that whatsoever, because as I said earlier at the very beginning of the webinar, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But you can have so much more of an impact when you go beyond just the shot and you look at the whole holistic story behind a specific animal and their ecosystem and any conservation issues that may arise through that. So I hope that has inspired some of you to start thinking in different ways about how you're going to go about photography on your next trip, learning a bit more about the species that you're aiming to take pictures of, or just enjoy, because sometimes it is very important, and we often forget this, I know I do, to just put your lens down for a moment and just soak that beautiful moment in, right? And really enjoy it for what it is. But I hope that this has inspired a few of you to kind of think about different ways and different approaches that you can bring to your photography beyond just getting the perfect image. And this is something that you can do on the NatHab trip, of course. The locations that I mentioned, the estancia itself, is all part of the NatHab trip that adventurers get to experience when they do go down to Patagonia at the edge of the world. So again, hopefully on your next trip, wherever it might be, whether Patagonia or around the world, you'll think about perhaps different ways to capture the images you want and to be able to tell the stories behind those images. And with that, Rob, I believe that we have some time for questions.
We absolutely do. All right, folks, before we dive into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that if you do have questions, feel free to submit them via the question field in your control panel. If you go to the upper right-hand corner, you will be able to find the question field. All right, so let's dive into it. So let's talk about some cameras for a second.
Yeah.
This guest is asking if a Nikon Coolpix 950 would be appropriate for wildlife photography.
Yeah, well, I will answer the same way that many of my professors have answered in the past, which is it depends. Of course, every single camera is different and it depends what you want to do with it. A Coolpix, like a point and shoot, for example, can be good for wildlife photography. I'm never going to say whether a camera is good or bad. I'm going to say it depends what you want to achieve with it. If you're looking to take, a shot of a puma that's really far away in vegetation, a Nikon Coolpix perhaps might not be your best tool. You might need something that has a bit more range, that has a bit more maneuverability, as well as a lot more manual settings on it. However, you still can get some beautiful, beautiful images. I have so many colleagues who use point and shoot cameras, who use old school film cameras as well. So it really depends what your objective is. My biggest suggestion when it comes to choosing the camera you want is seeing what the limitations are, as well as seeing what that camera is really good at. A very quick internet search will often give you the answers you need for that. So again, overall, when it comes to wildlife, it very much depends what your goal is with that. For someone starting out, point and shoots are great. You don't have to worry about all the technical settings, the manual settings. I am someone who likes to do everything in manual. Sure, I have some preset buttons on my camera, some custom settings that help me, when it comes to nighttime versus specific lighting. But if you're someone who's just starting to kind of look at wildlife photography, there's no wrong answer here. It's very much what you want to do with it. And you can end up with beautiful, beautiful images. It just depends on your subject, right? And again, this is where learning about wildlife behavior becomes so integral to helping you achieve your goals. Some animals, if you go out in 2 in the afternoon, there's no way you're going to see them because they're probably burrowing underground, like armadillos, for example. When it gets too hot outside, perhaps they're just underground in burrows. Certain birds are very active in the morning versus other times of the day. So to answer this in a different way and to kind of wrap up that answer, it isn't a bad camera by any means necessarily. It really depends what you want to do with it. And my biggest suggestion is look at what its limitations are versus what you want to do, as well as looking at the behaviors of the animals and learning their patterns.
Got it. Thank you so much for that answer. We do appreciate that. Getting to know what camera to take is important. If I just have an iPhone or a cell phone camera, is that going to be okay as well?
I love using my cell phone. I mean, cell phones nowadays, talking about the newer phones, whether it's an Android or an iPhone. I mean, I'm a huge encourager of using those. They are little computers that we have in our hands, and the cameras on them nowadays are fantastic. Of course, again, if you're trying to, take a picture of a puma that might be half a mile away, a phone's just not going to cut it. There are certain realities that we need to be aware of. But you can gain some beautiful images and video, of course. I mean, sometimes I prefer to use my iPhone when it comes to video. In this particular encounter with this puma in this image, we placed ourselves in a different angle later on that morning, and that puma walked about probably 30 feet in front of us. It was too close for me to use my telephoto. My wide angle happened to be in the car. I just took out my iPhone and was able to get some beautiful pictures of that animal, as well as some great video. So I love having my iPhone. Again, it has limitations, but you can get some stellar photography, especially because now on iPhones as well as Androids, you can take raw pictures and then go into post-processing and play around with those in a much more detailed way that you could in the past. So I encourage people, learn more about your iPhones, learn more about the settings, because you can play around with the frame rate for videos. You can play around with the amount of megapixels a certain picture is going to take. So I highly encourage people to play around with their phones. It's also a lot cheaper than getting all of the camera gear. You know, the amount of times that we see on photography trips where you'll have, you know, a pair of friends or a couple that comes together, and one of them is this avid photographer, the other person just has their iPhone. And sometimes the iPhone ends up taking, or pardon me, even an Android, sometimes the phone ends up taking better pictures. So yes, use your iPhone. Just be aware that, of course, there are limitations.
Perfect. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
All right. So are the pumas and their other relatives, you know, the cougars, mountain lions, are they evolving away from each other like finches on the Galapagos, for instance?
Ooh, that is a great question. Genetic diversity. I will be very honest when it comes to genetic diversity of pumas versus mountain lions versus cougars. I am not a specialist. Having talked to the specialists, however, there are, yes, some very slight genetic differences. We see that because they are so geographically spread out. Of course, they end up going after different prey. You know, pumas go after guanaco in the south versus up here in Canada, you know, our cougars or mountain lions, they will go after deer, and they are, of course, adapting to different climates on a certain level. So there are some small genetic diversification between populations. Beyond that, I wouldn't know exactly. So that will give me more stuff to research as we go on. And perhaps, very likely, there will be another Puma webinar later on in the spring or the summer that plays around with that question. So thank you for asking it.
All right. Inspiration comes from many places.
That's it. Be
Uh,
flexible, leave room for some magic.
I love it. I love it. So, what altitude are we going to be at when we see pumas and Astacia? How high are we getting up there?
Yeah,
Thank you
elevation.
for pronouncing.
No problem. Elevation, I don't remember exactly what elevation we're at. However, we are not high in the mountains. Pumas are not mountain dwelling animals. If anything, you will find them much more in the valleys. The reason for that is, again, their main source of prey, the guanacos, those are not mountain dwelling animals. They are in the steppes of Patagonia, so you'll find them in the valleys, you'll find them in the hills, but they are not high in the mountains. So you're not talking about being 4,000 or 5,000 feet in elevation, simply because at those elevations, there isn't the vegetation the guanacos need to be able to feed, which means that there is no reason for the pumas to be there. So generally speaking, you're at a pretty low elevation. Again, those animals being found mostly in valleys as well as steppes. By the way, steppes being these vast open grasslands. And if you recall that first image, that is very much what Patagonia looks like for the most part. Of course, you'll find forests, and you will find pumas in those forests, mostly on the Argentinian side for the most part. But no, you're not at any high elevations for this.
Gotcha. Good to know. So, what is the best time of year for me to come out there and actually experience this trip and see the pumas?
Yeah, again, the answer is it depends, right? And that's what I love about nature. There's something for everyone. When I was there recently, I was in that area around mid to late March, which is at the height of Patagonian summer, which means very early mornings and, of course, early evenings, with those animals being active, the most active around those times. So if you're someone who enjoys warmer temperatures, if you're someone who likes that sunlight, especially, that is the right time of year to go. If you're someone who doesn't mind braving some of the cold, it isn't necessarily a bad idea to think about going in April, for example, when the summer months start getting a bit chillier, for two reasons. One, the pumas themselves will be more active throughout the day with cooler temperatures. Also, with snow on the ground, it becomes a lot easier to spot these animals. Because let me tell you something, in Patagonia, even though a lot of it is grassland and you have these shrubs, pumas are dubbed the ghosts of Patagonia for a reason. They are difficult to spot, which is why on the NatHab trip, we go out with those local experts whose eyes are so well accustomed to land and being able to spot those very tiny little intricate movements on the landscape. So yes, it does depend what you want to see, when you want to go, and what type of human you are in terms of being able to adapt to weather systems. But January, great time if you're someone who enjoys the warmth. Again, keeping in mind it's Patagonia. You never really know what you're going to get. When we were there, it was exceptionally warm. We were talking about very warm temperatures to the point where we had t-shirts on every single day. However, sometimes it can get vastly cool. You can get very, very erratic weather patterns that come in. And then again, if you're someone who doesn't mind braving the cold, going in the colder months, not a bad idea because the animals are a bit more active throughout the day.
So during the spring trips, will we be likely to see more cubs?
Oh, that's hard to say. That's hard to say. I'm not going to give a definite answer to that. Of course, pumas and their cubs are so precious, and it's such a beautiful moment when you get to see a puma cub like that. So on a certain level, yes, patterns would dictate that, generally speaking, in the springtime, that is the North American springtime, so we're talking about April, there is more of a likelihood to see the cubs. January, we're looking on the verge of cubbing season. But yes, there is more of an opportunity. But again, it doesn't detract from the fact that they are highly elusive animals.
Do the sheepdogs have to worry about pumas?
Do the sheepdogs need to worry about pumas? Sheepdogs were bred to be able to protect their flocks. Their drive to defend the flock is so intrinsic to who they are as an animal that it doesn't become a question of worrying. And that is a bit of an anthropomorphization, putting a human kind of emotion to it. It's their job. To them, it is ingrained in their DNA. They want to defend their flock. In fact, when they are born, the puppies almost immediately after they're old enough to kind of see and walk around are introduced to the sheep to create that bond with those animals, because they become those defenders. So when they're out on the landscape, the folks at the foundation were telling us how when the sheepdogs are out there, they're constantly on guard. For the most part, they're relaxed. They're just walking around with the flocks. But of course, when they smell a pumas around, their senses become heightened. They get into that guard mode. So the term worry is maybe one that I wouldn't necessarily apply to them, because to them, it's not a question of worrying or not. It's the job that they were meant to do, bred to do, and that they grow up to learn to do, of course. So of course, like any animal, sure, they probably get a little bit stressed. They get, their senses become more heightened, but it's what they're meant to do, right? And talking with the foundation, the sheepdogs themselves, again, the idea here is not to create violent interactions. It's not to have the sheepdogs attack the pumas. And for the vast majority of cases, that's not what you get either. It is simply having their presence there so that pumas don't even think about coming into the enclosures with the sheep, and instead go back, turn around, and try to find wild prey, the guanaco specifically.
Gotcha. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you so much. All right. So how many days are we going to be out there when we jump on the tour, and how many people are going to be on this tour with us?
Absolutely. So 2027, wonderfully, is the itinerary is modified a little bit to really kind of maximize wildlife opportunities and the sites that come with that. Of course, it is a 9-day trip. Specifically at the estancia, you stay for 3 nights, and what is beautiful about that is, over the course of the days where you're at the estancia, you get to meet the ranchers, you get to go see these enclosures, the sheepdogs, you meet the people from the foundation, and in fact, you go out into these beautiful landscapes in the adapted vehicles with the conservationists, with the people from the foundation, and learn about the pumas, of course, keeping your eyes on the landscape as much as possible. And then afterwards, you end up in Torres del Paine, where you, of course, are still looking for wildlife while enjoying the beauties of all those sites. So pumas are elusive. Of course, there's no guarantees you're going to see them. But this is something that definitely surprised me the first time I went to Patagonia, which was the amount of wildlife that is around there. Beyond the pumas, you're seeing foxes, hopefully some armadillos, of course, because they are neat little critters. Tons of birds like condors, for example, as well as the caracara. Guanaco are pretty much all over the place. So it is kind of beautiful to see. You end up in this incredibly rugged, remote landscape that is so diverse and lively with all these animals. So the tour itself is 9 days. It starts on the Argentinian side of Patagonia in El Calafate, and then you start making your way across the border towards the estancia, which is in Chilean Patagonia. You went up in Torres del Paine, which of course is so emblematic of Patagonia. And you finish, of course, in Punta Arenas, which is where you leave. And the group sizes are, of course, by NetHab standards, they're nice and small. You know, we're talking less than a dozen people. And as it is for every NatHab trip, you know, that is the beauty of it, is having that small group dynamic to really allow us to be as immersed as possible without feeling the grind of having too many humans around us. Because, you know, time and time again, I love having this conversation with my guests, which is often revolving around the fact that most people don't like humans all that much. We love the animals. That's why we're there for it. And that is why I love NatHab, because we minimize the amount of people in a group to really ensure that you have the most immersive trip possible to make it very much a journey of a lifetime.
And that's appreciated, I am so sure. Let's swing back to cameras for another question.
Yeah.
So when I'm coming to Patagonia, can you give me a recommendation for lenses? This one guest is asking about an 18 to 400 millimeter lens or a 100-600. Should I bring both? What should I bring?
Yes, absolutely. And again, this is the beauty of photography. Everyone has such amazing setups, right? I'm someone who I like to keep it simple. I usually only have my wide angle and my telephoto. I brought my mid-range lens. I didn't use it so much. However, I definitely would have loved to have something like an 18 mil to, you know, up to about a 200, because you have so much more variance that you can play around with, as well as a big telephoto lens. So I'd say, yeah, absolutely, go for it. If you have the room for it, if you don't mind carrying with you, by all means, those lenses are great because you can have so much more of a spectrum to play around with. I love my gear for what it is. It has certain limitations, but by all means, I would definitely recommend that. I mean, having that wide open angle is so nice to be able to take in those landscapes while being able to quickly modify, instead of changing to a different lens, but simply just, you know, being able to zoom in and have that capacity to take a picture of an animal that's perhaps not right in front of you, but a bit further off. It's great to have a setup like that. So yes, I think that that is a great combination.
Awesome. Thank you. So I know this is probably a tough question to answer.
I love tough questions. Bring it on.
So I'm coming down to Patagonia. What is the one picture that I need to get, that I have to have?
Ooh, what is the one picture you have to have? That is a tough question, because I feel like that's such a personal question. You know, I'll say when I went down to Patagonia, there were two pictures I wanted. One was the picture that's right in front of you. I wanted a picture of a puma that was locking eyes with me, of course, through my lens. And I was able to get that. That is the picture that I wanted personally. It's such an iconic kind of emblem of what is Patagonia. The other picture I wanted was the one that I actually had at the very start, which was that landscape picture. You know, being able to capture how I felt when I was down there, which was just looking out at this unbelievably vast, beautiful landscape with little to no human impact whatsoever. And to me, that's what defines Patagonia, is this rich culture that's there in these little pockets, but the overall just immensity of it all, which again, sometimes is almost overwhelming in the best kind of way, because it makes you feel so small in this rugged environment. So to me, those are the two pictures that I wanted when I was down there, you know, but some people really want the condor pictures, because condors are also unbelievable. But I'd say, you know, do a bit of research, see what inspires you, and from that, decide what the pictures are that you want. You know, we all love different things. Some people who are avid birders, they're like, pumas are great. I'm here for the Magellanic woodpecker because it's such a cool little bird. So I'd say do a little bit of research, find your inspiration, and then decide what you want for your shot.
Great advice, Anthony. Thank you for that. Unfortunately, that will be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'm going to throw it back to you for some closing comments.
Thank you so much, Rob. And again, thank you everybody for taking your time out of your day to sit down. I love doing these webinars, and you know, I can only imagine on the other end of things, you know, we always hope that these do inspire you a little bit. And you know, my only closing remarks would be, again, the next time you go on a trip, if you're an avid photographer or someone who's just getting into photography, try to think about seeing these animals and these landscapes through a different lens. That pun was very much intended, by the way. You know, try to think about telling a story rather than just snapping a picture, because those pictures are memories and they're amazing. But sometimes it's nice to be able to dive a little bit deeper and to bring people into the world that you were able to explore. So find your inspiration, find your motivation, and then go out there. And most importantly, have fun with it, because that's what it comes down to. And if you can tell a conservation story along the way, great, but just have fun with it and find your inspiration.
Anthony, thank you so much for that advice and for taking the time to present for us today. We really appreciate it. And we'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. So if you are interested in information on how you can travel to Patagonia with NatHab, please give us a call at 800-543-8917 or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. And if you're part of a photo club and would like NatHab to speak to your members about nature and travel photography, email us at webinars@nathab.com. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. So long, my friends. We shall see you next time.